The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt looked absolutely unstoppable on paper when it arrived in England during early 1943. This beast packed 850 caliber machine guns, could take punishment that would shred other fighters, and had a supercharged engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. American pilots climbing into those massive cockpits for the first time felt invincible. They were about to learn a brutal lesson that nearly cost the 8th Air Force its entire fighter escort capability. On April 15, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group flew their first combat mission over occupied Europe. Within 20 minutes of crossing the Dutch coast, they encountered FW-190s. What happened next shocked everyone involved. The German fighters turned inside the P-47s like they were standing still. American pilots yanked back on their control columns, trying to follow their enemies and turning fights the way every fighter pilot had done since World War I. The Thunderbolts wallowed through the air, bleeding speed with every turn. Luftwaffe pilots carved them apart. 4 P-47s went down that day without scoring a single kill. The problem wasn't pilot skill or courage. These American aviators had trained extensively, understood aerial combat theory, and wanted desperately to prove their aircraft. But they were flying the P-47 like it was a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt, nimble fighters that succeeded through maneuverability. The Thunderbolt weighed 12,500 lb empty, fully loaded with fuel and ammunition. It pushed past 17ing 500 lb. That's roughly 3 tons heavier than a FW-90 and nearly 4 tons heavier than a Bf-109. Physics doesn't care about bravery. Through April and May of 1943, the losses mounted. American fighter pilots would spot German formations, engage in turning dogfights, and either get shot down or watch helplessly as their adversaries simply outturned them and escaped. The P-47's roll rate was decent, but its turn radius was abysmal compared to its opponents. Pilots reported feeling like they were flying trucks while Germans flew sports cars. Morale plummeted. Some aviators openly questioned whether the Thunderbolt was a fatal mistake, a poorly designed aircraft that would get them all killed. The numbers backed up their fears. Through spring 1943, P-47 units were achieving roughly 1 kill for every 2 losses, a catastrophic exchange ratio that couldn't be sustained. Combat reports from German pilots during this period reveal their confidence. Luftwaffe veterans described the early P-47 encounters as easy victories because American pilots insisted on fighting in the horizontal plane where the Thunderbolt's weight became an anchor. One FW-190 pilot wrote in his diary that shooting down Thunderbolts was simpler than training exercises because they could predict exactly what the Americans would do, try to turn and chase. Back at bases in England, maintenance crews could see the toll. P-47s returned with battle damage from stern attacks, evidence that German fighters were sitting comfortably behind them, while American pilots desperately tried to maneuver away. The aircraft's excellent durability meant more pilots survived to tell the story of their humiliation. But survival without victory was destroying unit effectiveness. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. The 8th Air Force couldn't afford many more months of fighter groups that couldn't actually fight. The bomber crews flying deep into Germany needed escorts that could not just accompany them, but actively destroy Luftwaffe interceptors. Every mission that came back with stories of P-47s being outmaneuvered was another mission where German fighters had free rein to slaughter B-17s and B-24s. The pressure on fighter group commanders to solve this problem was immense, and the solution when it came would flip every assumption about air combat upside down. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place, not from tactical manuals or headquarters directives, but from pilots who started paying attention to what happened when they stopped trying to turn with the enemy. Lieutenant Quint Brown of the 78th Fighter Group noticed something strange during a mission over the Zur Zede in June 1943. After a failed turning engagement with Bf-109s, he pushed his nose down towscape. His airspeed shot up rapidly, much faster than the Messids that tried following him. He pulled out of the dive several thousand FT lower, still alive, and that incident made him start thinking differently about his 7-to-9 fighter. The P-47's weight wasn't just a liability. In physics terms, that massive airframe stored kinetic energy differently than lighter fighters. When diving, the Thunderbolt converted its potential energy, altitude, into kinetic energy, speed, with devastating efficiency. That 17,500 lb mass, which made turning so sluggish, became a massive advantage in vertical maneuvers. The aircraft could accelerate in a dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe Terminal velocity for a P-47 in a controlled dive exceeded 550 mph. FW-190s and Bf-109s started experiencing control flutter and structural stress above. This wasn't a small edge. It was a fundamental physical advantage that negated every turning disadvantage the Thunderbolt suffered. Several pilots independently discovered they could outrun German fighters in dives, but connecting that observation to offensive tactics took time. The traditional dogfighting mindset was deeply ingrained. Fighter combat had always meant turning, circling, trying to get on your opponent's tail and stay there. Diving away felt like running, like cowardice. It took a specific kind of analytical mind to recognize that speed itself could be weaponized. That you didn't need to stay engaged in a turning fight if you could dictate engagement terms through vertical maneuvers. Energy tactics weren't completely unknown. Some experienced pilots understood the concept of trading altitude for speed, but applying this to heavy fighters as a primary doctrine was revolutionary. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine gave maximum power at high altitude around 25,000 to 30,000 ft. From that height, a Thunderbolt could dive on enemy formations, build enormous speed, make slashing attacks, and then zoom back up using that kinetic energy to regain altitude. The Germans couldn't follow effectively. Their engines lost power at high altitude and their lighter airframes couldn't match the P-47's dive acceleration. Test pilots had documented the P-47's dive performance during stateside trials, but those reports gathered dust because everyone focused on turn performance. The Army Air Force fighter doctrine in 1942 emphasized maneuverability above all else. The specifications that led to the P-47's design prioritized heavy armament and durability for bomber escort, but tactical employment still assumed dogfighting would follow traditional patterns. Nobody in command had seriously considered that a fighter might succeed by refusing to turn fight entirely. By mid-1943, informal discussions among P-47 pilots revealed a pattern. The survivors, the pilots with multiple missions and no losses, were the ones who had accidentally or intentionally avoided prolonged turning engagements. They climbed high, dove fast, made quick attacks, and zoomed away. They treated altitude like a bank account, spending it deliberately for speed, then investing that speed back into altitude through zoom climbs. The pilots who kept trying to mix it up in turning fights kept dying or scoring no kills. The weight that made the P-47 turn like a bus also meant it could smash through turbulence that would rattle lighter aircraft. That 7-ton mass provided stability in high-speed dives. Pilots could keep their gun sight steady on target, while screaming down at speeds that would have German pilots fighting their control columns just to avoid structural failure. The same aircraft that felt sluggish and unresponsive in turns became a precise, stable gun platform when diving. Understanding this distinction, knowing when weight helped and when it hurt, separated the pilots who would revolutionize fighter tactics from those who would continue struggling with outdated methods. Colonel Hubert Zemke took command of the 56th Fighter Group in August 1943, and he arrived with a reputation for analytical thinking that bordered on obsession. Zemke wasn't interested in glory or romantic notions of aerial combat. He studied loss reports like an accountant examining bad investments, and what he saw horrified him. His group had been hemorrhaging experienced pilots while achieving mediocre kill ratios. The numbers told a story that contradicted everything the Army Air Force taught about fighter tactics, and Zemke decided numbers didn't lie. He started by interviewing every pilot who had survived encounters with the Luftwaffe. Not the official after-action reports. Those were sanitized and formal, but brutal, honest conversations about what actually happened in combat. The pattern emerged quickly. Pilots who climbed high before engagement and attacked in steep dives had better survival rates and more kills. Pilots who got sucked into horizontal turning fights either died or came home empty-handed. Zemke took this data to his operations officer and made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if it failed. He threw out the standard fighter tactics manual. The new doctrine was simple but radical. Never turn with the enemy. The 56th Fighter Group would climb to 30,000 ft before entering combat zones, position themselves above German formations, and attack in high-speed dives. Pilots would fire during the dive, blow through the enemy formation, use their speed to zoom climb back to altitude, and repeat. If a German fighter tried to follow them up, the P-47's superior high-altitude performance would let them extend away. If Germans tried to follow them down, the Thunderbolt's dive speed would open the gap. The enemy's only option was to watch helplessly as American fighters repeatedly slashed through their formations. ZMA faced immediate resistance from his own pilots. Lieutenant Colonel David Schilling, one of his squadron commanders, argued this approach was cowardly. Real fighter pilots stayed and fought. They didn't hit and run like bandits. ZMA's response became legendary in the 56th Fighter Group. Dead heroes don't win wars. Live pilots who kill the enemy do. He made it clear that any pilot who disobeyed the new doctrine and engaged in turning fights would face disciplinary action. Survival and victory mattered more than satisfying someone's romantic notion of chivalrous combat. The first mission using ZMA's tactics flew on October 8, 1943, targeting Bremen. The 56th Fighter Group climbed to 32,000 FT and waited. When Luftwaffe fighters rose to intercept the bomber stream, ZMA led his group down in a coordinated dive. They hit 450 mph before reaching the German formation. The P-47s ripped through the Bf-109s like cannonballs through paper. German pilots scattered in all directions, their formation cohesion destroyed instantly. The Americans zoomed back up, reformed at altitude, and dove again 15 minutes later. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 8 kills that day without a single loss. The numbers finally worked in America's favor. Word spread fast. Other pilots in the group who had been skeptical suddenly became believers when they survived their first dive attack mission. The psychological effect was immediate. American pilots felt like they controlled the engagement for the first time since arriving in Europe. They weren't reacting to German maneuvers anymore. They were forcing Germans to react to them. That shift in initiative mattered enormously for morale and effectiveness. CMA refined the doctrine through October and November. He established specific altitude requirements. Never engage below 25,000 FT if possible. He created communication protocols so flights could coordinate their dives, hitting enemy formations from multiple angles simultaneously. He emphasized fire discipline. Pilots would get one good burst during each diving pass, maybe 3 seconds of trigger time. Spray and pray didn't work at 450 mils. You aimed, fired, and trusted your 850 calibers to do the job. The goal wasn't prolonged engagement. It was maximum violence delivered in minimum time, then disengagement before the enemy could respond effectively. This was industrial-era warfare applied to the sky, efficient, brutal, and utterly effective. Executing a proper dive attack through an enemy formation required precision that turned pilots into engineers mid-combat. The maneuver started at altitude, ideally 28,000 to 32,000 FT, where P-47 pilots scanned below for German formations. Spotting the enemy was critical. Pilots looked for contrails, the white streaks left by aircraft engines in cold high-altitude air, or the dark silhouettes of German fighters against clouds or ground. Once located, the attack geometry began. The P-47 pilot would position himself several thousand FT above and ideally up-sun from the target formation. Sun position mattered enormously. German pilots looking up toward a diving Thunderbolt would be blinded if the American attacked from the sun's direction. This wasn't luck. It was calculated positioning that took several minutes of maneuvering before the actual attack. Flight leaders communicated constantly, ensuring all 4 aircraft in a flight were positioned correctly before committing to the dive. The dive itself started shallow, maybe 30-degree nose down, while the pilot advanced his throttle to maximum power. The P-47 accelerated quickly and airspeed became everything. Pilots watched their airspeed indicators climb 300 ms, 350,400. At around 400 ms, the pilot would steepen his dive to 45 or 50 degree. The aircraft shook as it approached speeds that would terrify pilots in lighter fighters. Control surfaces stiffened. The control column required genuine muscle to move. This was why the P-47's weight helped. That mass damped out turbulence and kept the aircraft steady even as airspeed pushed toward 450 or 480 Mors. Gunsight discipline separated successful attacks from wasted ammunition. At these speeds, the pilot had perhaps 2 or 3 seconds of effective firing time. The gunsight picture changed rapidly. A target appeared, grew larger, then flashed past. Pilots learned to start firing at around 400 yards and hold the trigger down as they closed to 200 yards. The 850 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, created a cone-off fire that converged where the guns were harmonized, typically set for 300 wide. At that range, even a 1-second burst put 40 to 50 rounds into the target area. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds would tear through aluminum, hit fuel tanks, shatter engines, or kill pilots. The critical moment came immediately after firing. Lesser pilots would try to follow their target, watching to see if they scored hits. That mistake killed people. The dive attack doctrine demanded immediate commitment to the through pass. The pilot kept his nose down, maintained or increased speed, and blasted completely through the enemy formation. German fighters above and beside the target would be turning, trying to engage, but the P-47 was already past them, diving away at speeds they couldn't match. This was the maneuver's genius. The attacking pilot was only vulnerable for about 3 seconds, the time between entering effective firing range and punching through the formation's lower boundary. Once clear below the enemy formation, the pilot would begin his recovery. Pulling out of a 450 meat dive required careful technique. Yank back too hard and you could overstress the airframe or worse, black out from the G-forces. The proper recovery was a smooth, firm pull that brought the nose up gradually. The P-47's rugged construction tolerated pulls that would have torn the wings off lighter aircraft, but pilots still respected the limits. As the nose came up through the horizon, all that kinetic energy from the dive converted into potential energy, altitude. The Thunderbolt would zoom climb, sometimes regaining 5,000 or 6,000 ft from the momentum of its dive alone. The zoom climb was where engine power at altitude paid dividends. The R-2800 engine with its turbo supercharger kept producing power even as the aircraft climbed back toward 30,000. Five German fighters trying to follow found their engines gasping, in the thin air losing power, forcing them to level off or descend. The P-47 just kept climbing, and within minutes the pilot was back at attack altitude, reforming with his flight, setting up for another diving pass. German pilots had faced skilled opponents before, RAF Spitfire pilots over Britain, Soviet airmen at Stalingrad. But the P-47 dive attacks created something different. Luftwaffe veterans described it as psychological warfare delivered at 450 meters. The fear wasn't just about getting shot, it was about helplessness. When Thunderbolts dove through formations, German pilots couldn't fight back effectively. They could only scatter and hope. Overbeloit Franz Stigler, a Bf-109 pilot with Jagerschwad 27, wrote in his mission diary from November 1943 about an encounter with the 56th Fighter Group. His staff, 9 aircraft flying in tight formation, was climbing to intercept B-17s when American fighters appeared above them. Stigler described seeing black shapes detaching from the high cover, and then the terrifying acceleration as P-47s came down. His formation commander tried calling evasive maneuvers, but the radio discipline collapsed instantly. Each pilot broke in a different direction, pure survival instinct overriding training. The Thunderbolts punched through their formation in seconds, and Stigler watched 2 of his squadron mates go down, trailing smoke. The Americans didn't state a dogfight. They were already climbing away before the Germans could regroup. This pattern repeated across every major air battle from late 1943 onward. Luftwaffe tactical reports show a consistent theme. American fighters attacking from high altitude caused immediate formation breakdown. Squadron cohesion was everything in air combat. Fighters flying in coordinated groups could cover each other, concentrate firepower, and execute complex maneuvers. But when P-47s came screaming down at speeds German aircraft couldn't match, that cohesion evaporated. Each pilot became isolated, worried about his own survival, unable to trust that his wingman was still there. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate attack. German pilots began spending more time looking up than looking for bombers. Formation leaders had to position their units higher, burning precious fuel to gain altitude that might protect them from diving attacks. But climbing higher meant less time at combat altitude, reduced endurance over target areas, and engines struggling in thin air where the P-47's turbo supercharger gave Americans the advantage. The Luftwaffe faced an impossible choice: stay lower and be vulnerable to dive attacks, or climb higher and sacrifice effectiveness. Luftwaffe command structure struggled to develop counter-tactics. Some units tried splitting into 2 elements, one high to engage the P-47s, one lower to hit bombers. This divided force proved ineffective because the Americans would simply dive on whichever element was lower, scatter it, then zoom back up before the high element could intervene. Other German units tried tightening their formations, flying closer together so dive attacks would be more dangerous for Americans. This made them more vulnerable to the P-47's concentrated firepower. 850 caliber guns didn't care if targets were close together. It just meant more hits per burst. The most significant psychological effect was unpredictability. Traditional dogfighting had rhythm and flow. Pilots could anticipate opponent moves, react, counter-react, but P-47 dive attacks offered no rhythm. Germans never knew when the attack would come, from what angle or how many aircraft would participate. Sometimes a single Thunderbolt would dive through. Sometimes an entire squadron would come down in sequence, one after another, giving the Germans no time to reform between attacks. This unpredictability created constant stress that wore down even experienced pilots. Major Heinz Baer, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 victories, gave an interview to German military intelligence in January 1944, where he admitted the American dive tactics were nearly impossible to counter with our current aircraft. He noted that trying to climb after P-47s was futile, and diving away meant abandoning the bombers they were supposed to intercept. His conclusion was brutally honest. We must shoot them before they reach altitude or accept that we cannot engage them on favorable terms. That admission from one of Germany's top fighter pilots revealed how completely the tactical equation had shifted. The numbers told a story that even skeptics couldn't ignore. Before Hubsky implemented dive attack tactics in August 1943, the 56th Fighter Group's kill-to-loss ratio hovered around 1.2.1. They were barely breaking even. By December 1943, after 4 months of the new doctrine, that ratio had jumped to 4.71. The 56th was destroying German fighters at nearly 5 times the rate they were losing their own aircraft. This wasn't marginal improvement. It was a complete transformation of combat effectiveness. January 1944 brought even more dramatic results. During Big Week, a series of massive bomber raids against German aircraft production facilities in February, the 56th Fighter Group claimed 82 aerial victories in 7 days, while losing only 11 aircraft. Major Gerald Johnson alone shot down 7 German fighters during this period, all using the high-altitude dive attack method. His combat reports describe each engagement similarly. Climb high, spot enemy formation, dive through at maximum speed, zoom back to altitude, repeat. No prolonged dogfights, no turning contests, just brutal efficiency. The comparison with other P-47 groups proved the doctrine's value. The 78th Fighter Group, which initially resisted ZMA's tactics and continued trying to dogfight, suffered 23 aircraft losses in January 1944, while claiming only 14 kills. Their ratio was inverted. They were losing almost 2 aircraft for every German they shot down. By March, after the 78th commander visited the 56th to observe their methods and implemented similar tactics, their ratio improved to 3.1 to 1. The change in doctrine alone, flying the same aircraft, more than tripled their effectiveness. Individual pilot statistics reinforced the pattern. Robert Johnson, flying with the 56th under ZMA's doctrine, achieved 27 confirmed kills by May 1944 without being shot down once. His secret wasn't superior flying skill. Other pilots were equally talented. His advantage was ruthless adherence to dive attack principles. Johnson's mission reports are almost mechanical in their consistency. Altitude advantage maintained throughout combat. High-speed diving passes only. No pursuit of targets into low-altitude turning fights. Immediate zoom climb after every attack. He treated air combat like a repeatable industrial process, and the results spoke for themselves. The 8th Air Force Headquarters collected data across all fighter groups through 1944. Groups that adopted high-altitude dive tactics showed consistent improvement. The 4th Fighter Group, flying P-47s from March through September 1944, recorded 141 kills against 23 losses using these methods, a 6.1.1 ratio. The 300T Fighter Group, formed later and trained in dive tactics from the start, achieved 7.2.1. These weren't accidents or statistical anomalies. The tactical doctrine worked, and it worked spectacularly. German loss records provided confirmation from the other side. Luftwaffe quartermaster reports from mid-1944 show that fighter losses over Germany increased 73% between January and June, even though the total number of German fighters hadn't decreased substantially. The Germans were losing aircraft faster than they could replace them, and captured Luftwaffe pilots consistently cited American dive attacks as a primary cause. One interrogation report from a German pilot shot down in April 1944 stated that his entire group had been rendered combat ineffective after losing 12 aircraft in 3 days to diving P-47s. The tactical revolution. Success extended beyond simple kill ratios. Bomber losses decreased significantly once P-47 groups mastered dive attacks. In early 1943, the 8th Air Force often lost 57% of bombers per mission. unsustainable losses that nearly ended the daylight bombing campaign. By summer 1944, with effective fighter escort using proper tactics, bomber losses dropped to 1 to 2% per mission. The P-47 groups weren't just surviving. They were accomplishing their primary mission of protecting the bombers. German fighters that scattered from diving attacks couldn't maintain coordinated bomber interceptions. The mathematics of attrition had reversed. Now Germany was bleeding aircraft and experienced pilots at rates that would the Luftwaffe's defensive capability before 1944 ended. The tactical revolution didn't spread through official channels or training manuals revised at headquarters. It spread through bar conversations between missions and in brutal post-combat debriefings where surviving pilots explained what actually worked. By January 1944, every P-47 group in the 8th Air Force had heard about the 56th's success. Some commanders embraced the new methods immediately. Others resisted until their loss rates forced change. Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group visited ZMU's operations room in February 1944. Blakesley was a veteran who'd flown with the RAF before America entered the war, and he had strong opinions about air combat. He spent 2 days watching the 56th's mission planning, listening to briefings and studying their engagement protocols. What convinced him wasn't theory. It was the mission board showing 56th pilots with 10, 15, 20 kills and still alive. Pilots using old tactics were dead. Blakesley returned to his group and implemented dive attack doctrine within a week. The 352nd Fighter Group, activated in July 1943, had the advantage of learning these tactics before developing bad habits. Their commander, Colonel Joe Mason, corresponded regularly with ZMA and incorporated dive attack principles into the group's initial training. New pilots arriving in England learned immediately. Altitude is life. Speed is weapon. Never turn with the enemy. The 352nd's first combat mission in September 1943 used pure dive attack tactics, and they achieved a 5.1 kill ratio in their first month of combat. This proved the doctrine worked even with inexperienced pilots if they followed the principles. The tactics evolved through practical experience. Pilots discovered that diving through enemy formations worked even better when multiple flights coordinated their attacks. The 56th developed a ladder technique where 4 ship flights would stack at different altitudes, one at 32,000 FT, another at 30,000, a third at 28,000. They'd dive in sequence 15 seconds apart, giving German pilots no time to reform between attacks. The first flight would scatter the formation, the second would catch Germans trying to regroup, and the third would hit the survivors. This rolling attack could sustain pressure for several minutes, completely destroying enemy unit cohesion. Radio discipline became crucial. Early dive attacks suffered from communication breakdown. Pilots screaming, "Break right or bogey at 6 Gaun," flooded the radio with useless chatter. Some instituted strict protocols. Flight leaders called the initial dive. After that, radio silence except for critical threats or kill confirmation. Pilots trusted their wingmen to follow through the attack without constant communication. This discipline allowed better situational awareness because pilots could actually hear important calls instead of filtering through noise. The doctrine adapted as the air war evolved. By spring 1944, the Luftwaffe started avoiding combat with high-flying P-47 formations, instead focusing on bombers when American fighters were caught low on fuel or out of position. P-47 groups responded by splitting their formations. One section maintained high patrol looking for German fighters, while another section flew closer to the bombers as immediate escort. If Germans attacked the bombers, the high section would dive on them. This flexibility showed the doctrine's maturity. It wasn't rigid procedure, but adaptable principle. Training new replacement pilots became systematized by mid-1944. Fresh pilots, arriving from the States, received immediate indoctrination in dive attack tactics. Experienced pilots took them up for practice missions, demonstrating proper diving technique, zoom climbs, and formation discipline. The newcomers flew their first combat missions as wingmento veterans, learning by observation before attempting attacks themselves. This mentorship approach reduced new pilot losses significantly. The 56th's replacement pilot loss rate dropped from 40% in early 1943 to 112% by late 1944. Other aircraft types adopted modified versions of the tactics. P-51 Mustangs, arriving in significant numbers by spring 1944, used similar dive attack principles but with different execution due to their lighter weight and better turning ability. P-38 Lightnings in the 15th Air Force over Italy implemented dive tactics that exploited their twin-engine power advantages. The fundamental principle, use your aircraft's strengths, avoid its weaknesses, dictate engagement terms through altitude and speed, proved universal across fighter types. The P-47's dive attack doctrine didn't end with World War II. It fundamentally altered how air forces thought about fighter employment, particularly the relationship between aircraft characteristics and tactical doctrine. The lesson was clear. Designing aircraft and developing tactics as separate processes led to disasters like the early P-47 experience. Success required matching tactical employment to physical capabilities, even if that meant abandoning traditional combat methods. Korean. Warfighter pilots flying F-86 Sabres against MiG-15s rediscovered energy tactics independently before realizing they were applying P-47 principles. The Sabre was heavier than the MiG, turned slower at low speeds but dominated in high-speed dives and zoom climbs. American pilots who tried turning with MiGs suffered the same fate as early P-47 pilots fighting FW-190s. Those who studied World War II after-action reports recognized the pattern. They climbed high, dove fast, made slashing attacks, and zoomed away. The F-86's kill ratio against MiG-15s reached 10-1, not because it was a superior aircraft in all respects, but because American pilots understood energy management, while many Soviet and Chinese pilots relied on turn fighting. Colonel John Boyd revolutionized fighter tactics in the 1960s by formalizing these principles into energy maneuverability theory. Boyd's work at the Fighter Weapons School created mathematical models for comparing aircraft performance across different flight regimes. His famous UDA loop concept, observe, orient, decide, act, described how fighters could win by controlling engagement tempo rather than raw maneuverability. Boyd studied World War II combat extensively, and Hubert Zemke's 56th Fighter Group missions appeared repeatedly in his case studies. The P-47's transformation from liability to dominant fighter exemplified Boyd's thesis that tactical flexibility mattered more than platform specifications. The F-4 Phantom in Vietnam initially suffered from the same doctrinal mismatch that plagued early P-47 operations. Designers built the Phantom as a missile or armed interceptor, but combat over North Vietnam devolved into close-range dogfights where the F-4's size and weight hurt maneuverability. Early loss rates were unacceptable. Then the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, started teaching energy tactics derived directly from World War II and Korea. Phantom crews learned to use their aircraft's thrust advantage and dive performance rather than trying to turn with lighter MiG-17s and MiG-21s. Kill ratios improved dramatically. The same aircraft flown differently became effective. Modern air combat in the missile age seems far removed from 1943's machine gun duels, but the underlying physics remain identical. An F-15 or F-35 still converts altitude to speed, still uses energy state to dictate engagement terms, still exploits zoom climbs, torset tactical situations. The weapons changed from bullets to radar-guided missiles, but managing energy state determines who controls the fight. Every fighter pilot today learns basic fighter maneuvers that descend directly from P-47 dive tactics. High yo-yo, low yo-yo, vertical scissors, all applications of energy management principles that Zemke's pilots discovered through trial and error. The P-47 story teaches broader lessons about military adaptation. Organizations naturally resist changing successful methods, even when circumstances change. The Army Air Force's pre-war tactical doctrine succeeded in training exercises and small-scale conflicts, so commanders assumed it would work in Europe. Early combat proved otherwise, but institutional inertia kept many units trying failed approaches for months. Change came from mid-level commanders like ZMA, who had authority to experiment and courage to discard doctrine that killed their men. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Tactical innovation comes from those close enough to combat to see what works, but senior enough to implement change. The human element mattered as much as physics. Za's pilots trusted his judgment. Because he studied their survival, not abstract theories. He changed tactics to keep them alive, not to satisfy headquarters' expectations. That trust allowed rapid implementation of counterintuitive methods. Telling fighter pilots not to dogfight required credibility earned through demonstrated concern for their survival. Leadership style mattered. The P-47 Thunderbolt's legacy lives in every fighter doctrine that prioritizes energy management, in every tactical manual that emphasizes using aircraft strengths rather than fighting opponents' fights, and in the fundamental understanding that victory comes from adapting tactics to physics rather than forcing physics to obey preferred tactics.